And if you don't mind muting the microphone while unless you're asking a question, I'm just hearing some.
Oh, yes, yes. Everybody, please mute yourselves. Okay. I don't know where. I can't tell if we're we're recording. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. The library is very pleased to have Bo Seo discuss his new book, Good Arguments: How Debate Teaches Us to Listen and Be Heard. What? Oh, we have the book in the library also to be checked out. So he's going to talk about why argument is important, and interspersed with a few stories from his book. He's a two-time world champion debater and a former coach of the Australian national debating team and the Harvard Debating Union. And he's currently a Juris Doctor candidate at Harvard Law School. So please join me in welcoming Bo Seo.
Thank you so much. And I want to start by thanking Rebecca and Elizabeth for having me. This was actually one of the first invitations to speak that I received when the book was just making its way onto the world. And I'm sorry it's taken us a little bit of time to find a suitable date, but it's the enterprising work of librarians and really their magpie eye that allowed me to be here. So I'm really appreciative of that, and I'm so pleased to see all of you and to have heard a little bit from you about your involvement in the community and the ways in which disagreement and debate come into your lives. And I think we're such a number that it would be really rewarding for me to hear as much from you about whether some of these ideas resonate, whether they don't chime with what you've seen, and that way we'll be able to make it more of a conversation. And you know, in some ways, the library is the kind of civic space where, in addition to coming along with like-minded folks, we want to be able to have productive disagreements about the things that matter. And so even though it's on Zoom, I hope that'll be a part of the flavor of this evening. So to start things off and to put some pieces on the table, I will try and do three things. I'll tell you a bit about how I came to write this book, which is entitled Good Arguments. I'll tell you what's in the book, and then I'll finish by giving a couple of lessons from the book that you might be able to take away with you, hopefully use in your everyday disagreements, and will give you a sense of flavor of the kind of contribution that I'm trying to make. So how did I come to write this book? I started debating because I moved when I was 8 years old from South Korea to Australia, and I didn't speak English at the time. And I very quickly learned that the hardest part of crossing language lines, and some of you on this call might have had that experience yourself, that the hardest part of doing that was adjusting to real life conversation, which were nothing like what the textbook suggested they might be, or what the English as a second language tape suggested they might be, which is very courteous and regular and kind of metered conversations. And I learned too that the hardest conversations to adjust to were disagreements, because that was when the rhythms of ordinary speech tended to break down and tempers ran. You felt the fight or flight kind of instinct warring against one another, and people tended to interrupt. And I think I sensed too at the time what a lot of newcomers to a place do. And I experienced this as an immigrant, but I think I've since recognized it as a feeling that we all get when we go to a new workplace or a new neighborhood or a new gathering where we don't know a lot of people, which is that our belonging to that place or our welcomeness to that place is conditional. And that condition is not raising our voice too much, objecting, and kind of rocking the boat. And that sense that disagreeing and drawing attention to the differences that existed between me and my peers would unseat what belonging I had been able to achieve, that in addition to just the difficulty of conversing and disagreeing, made me resolve to be very agreeable. So I learned to smile and nod along and keep most of my thoughts to myself. And I thought that would be the kind of groove in which I would ride out at least my childhood. And I guess it must have felt like at that time, it would have been what the rest of my life might have been like. And the thing that broke me out of that was a promise that my 5th grade teacher made me, which was that in debate, on the debate team, when one person speaks, no one else does. And to someone who had been spoken over and never given the time of day or spun out of conversation, that sounded like a kind of salvation. I knew I had to reach for it. And so I ended up signing up, counterintuitively, madly, to this activity that made a sport of disagreement. And in the 5th grade, when I went to an elementary school called the Bush School, the bush being a very typical kind of landscape in Australia, overgrown, sprawling, kind of rough, the nature almost engulfing the edges of the school. I remember the first debate in the school auditorium with the rain beating down on the corrugated iron roof on the top of the building, forming a kind of a percussion as I went onto the stage. And I'd been assigned to be the first speaker, arguing that we should ban all zoos. Something I haven't really thought about since. But that was a topic and we'd prepared. And I remember standing up on stage, looking into the audience, that as I began to speak, all of these little changes were perceptible. And they were a little wince of recognition in the corner of people's eye as they heard something that sounded familiar to them or interesting to them. It was a slight nod of the head. It was someone just unfolding their arm. And those very small movements made me feel that what had previously seemed like very hard surfaces, immovable objects, a reality around which I would have to assimilate and fit myself around, that maybe through the power of language and speech, I might be able to change something about this world too, that I could be in conversation with it rather than it being the given and me being the person to adjust him or herself to it. And so from that moment, I knew I was kind of hooked. And I spent the next 15 years having this competitive career that went from debating for Australia and then in university debating for Harvard, and traveling all over the world, trying to eke out every bit of competitive advantage as I can in this very strange activity that made a competition out of disagreeing, right? Out of disagreeing well, out of disagreeing better than the other side. And we can talk a bit about what that means. And the great kind of triumph, at least in my life, came in January 2016 when my debate partner, Fanele, and I won for Harvard the World Universities Debate Championships. And the competition, which unfolded in Greece, has about 500 teams, right? And the structure of debate competitions at the World Universities level is that it becomes knockout after a while. So there's only one winner. And we were in the 499 all the time. So much so that that's where we assumed our place was, right? And, I've been sort of reflecting throughout book tour that the fact that you're doomed to lose in that way makes debate something more than a game of winning and losing, right? Because you're guaranteed to lose at some point. That shifts our attention to whether we're disagreeing well, in addition to whether we're winning or not, right? It humbles you and teaches you that you can be right and unpersuasive on the day, right? So I had this education in losing, but having said that one time felt really very good. And that came in January 2016. And I was approached to write this book for the first time at that time. And if I had written it then, it would have been a kind of a sports memoir that just traces the journey of a slightly improbable outsider in the sport, learning it, doing well, taking the losses, but on the way to a grand victory. But what happened not so many months after that great win was the presidential election cycle between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, where the debates became not only a symbol of the polarization that had beset this country where I was living at the time, but also became a driver of that division, right? Watching it, you could feel things getting worse in some ways. And it felt as though some of the features of debate, its adversarial quality, the fact that it's a spectacle, that it rewards, in some instances, shows of dominance, right, rather than real engagement. That made me feel that debate, that's when I knew it was a rich subject, because it wasn't an unmitigated good, right? It contained shades of darkness as well as possibilities of the good. The year after I graduated from Harvard in 2017, I moved to China on a fellowship program that had been established as a kind of a bridge between the US and China at a time of real optimism about what people-to-people exchange and cultural exchange could achieve. And halfway through that year, the trade war between the two countries began, and the great freeze that we're currently living through set in. The year after that, I went back home to Sydney and took on a job as a political reporter at a newspaper and covered an election that mirrored a lot of the toxicity and divisiveness of what I had seen in the US during the presidential cycle here. And in that moment, it became really difficult to see disagreement as anything other than a source of pain and divisiveness and even of almost existential danger. And I felt all over again what I had felt as an 8-year-old, which was the urge to run away from conflict, to be averse to it all over again, to think it no good, that it could do me no good to engage in that kind of disagreement. And it was then that I started thinking about, well, what was it that got me out of that posture of conflict aversion in the first instance? And it was debate. And I wondered whether this body of knowledge of how we disagree, kind of like negotiations is a body of knowledge. I wondered whether this body of knowledge had something positive to contribute. And I wondered whether debate as a community built around and not despite of disagreement could act as a kind of a testament or an example. Because in the end, that aspiration to make our differences work for us and not against us seemed to me such an important part of the democratic project, but also of what we try and do in our workplaces, in our families, in our communities. So it was with that kind of desire to find something useful to say in this moment that I found myself thinking back to my education in debate and wanting to share those lessons, wanting to share the ambivalences in some part, and wanting to share the strategies that I found useful with the reader. So then the book that ended up being produced, that I wrote, that we put together, is in 2 parts. The first part goes through the different elements of debate, starting from knowing what the topic of a dispute is, to making arguments, to doing rebuttal, to using language and speech and gesture to be maximally persuasive. It covers knowing which arguments to take on and which to let go, right? So choosing our battles. And my aim with this first half is to take people from a position of knowing nothing about debate, though some readers will obviously be much more experienced in it, to knowing as much as I do. And the structure of it almost reads like a memoir, because the other person who knew nothing about debate was me, right? And if I could walk people through that journey of how I came to pick up these pieces, I thought that might be a way to guide people through, so that it doesn't feel like a manual where you have a voice telling from on high, this is what the truth is, but rather going through a journey and seeing how these pieces stack on top of each other. So once I've done that and gone through those different pieces, I then apply it to different kinds of disagreements that I think we encounter in our lives. And that goes from disagreements with bullies to disagreements in our personal relationships, disagreements in education, disagreements online, and how technology is changing how we disagree. So that's the basic structure of the book. And maybe in the last 5 minutes, I'll share with you a couple of lessons, just by way of example, of how the strategies of debate can inform and change and perhaps should change how it is that we approach everyday disagreements. So I'll share 2 of those. The first is that every disagreement in debate begins with some amount of agreement. And that is agreement about how we're going to have the conversation and you've heard why that was important to me, that we're going to agree that we're going to have equal time in this exchange, that we're going to take turns, right? I'm going to get a go, you're going to get a go, but I'm going to respond, so I don't have to interrupt you in the middle of it, right? That we're going to try and be respectful and courteous, and keep our focus on the ideas rather than on the personality. So there's an agreement about how we're going to have the dispute, but there's also agreement about what the dispute is about. Right? And the importance of naming what a disagreement is about is that you're implicitly saying what it's not about, right? So in a debate about, or in a disagreement about the dirty dishes, saying we are just arguing about the dirty dishes means it's not about what you did to me last week, right? Or what your cousin said the other day at the family dinner, or it's not about whether we love each other, right? Those things are off the table. That's not what we're discussing, right? And in some ways, that is easier said than done, because as I go through in the book, and one of the first things you learn as a debater is what appears to be one debate on the surface actually contains many disagreements, right? So I had friends here arguing about whether they should send their children to the local public school, for example. And that seems like a pretty simple discussion about what they should do, right? There are some children, they need to go to some school, and should it be the local public school or something else? And so that feels like a pretty simple debate about prescription. But embedded in that may be factual disagreements about, say, whether the school has a music program or not, right? Or whether it has adequate sporting facilities or not, right? And that's a factual disagreement that maybe the right response isn't to argue about it, but to look it up, right? Or to find the answer. It might contain a more philosophical disagreement about what our obligations as parents are, whether it is just to the kids, or whether there's some obligation to the local public school system to try and invest in it, to take part in it. And so what seems on surface like a very simple discussion about what we should do with the kids contains all of these different disagreements. And the importance of seeing that is, again, to go to the point about starting with some measure of agreement. Before we launch into a disagreement, we might want to pause and just check, are we disagreeing about the right thing? Is this the heart of the dispute? Because it is in both sides' interests to not talk past one another in this way, not to contribute to this climate of conflict without giving us a way of doing something about it. So the more we can think about ourselves as collaborators in some ways, of collaborators in building a disagreement, and not just people who happen to be in opposition, the more we can think about the agreement that should precede the disagreement that is to come, I think the better. The second lesson that I want to mention more briefly is that debate entails a kind of a commitment to express ourselves and to try and persuade one another through argument, right? So it's there are lots of ways of persuading someone, right? So you could coerce them, there are different things, but debate amounts to a promise, a commitment to do it through argument. And an argument is not just a collection of random things you believe about a subject, or a repetition of what you believe, or things that vaguely support your perspective. Debate calls on us to give it a structure, right? And to ask ourselves, well, what is it that an argument has to do? And I've found that in general, an argument has to do at least two things. It has to show that its main claim is true and that its main claim is important. So if I'm arguing, we should plant trees because it's good for the environment, the two things that that argument has to do, the two burdens that it has to carry, the two kind of goals that it needs to achieve is to show that it is in fact true that planting trees is good for the environment, and that the fact that it is good for the environment means we should do it, right? So if it's not true that planting trees is good for the environment, then there's, the argument falls apart. But if you're not able to show that it being good for the environment is enough of a reason for us to do it, as opposed to factoring in cost or convenience or whatever else might get in the way, then the argument doesn't work as well. So in order to kind of meet those basic burdens, I invite people in the book to think about a basic structure that I call the 4 W's, which is asking yourself, what is the argument? Why is it true? When has it happened before? So can you give an example or a case study? And who cares, right? Why does it matter? And though that's a kind of a slightly formulaic approach, I think it can be useful as almost a checklist of, as you're making an argument, to stop yourself from just repeating or emoting or in a kind of an unstructured way getting it across, but making sure you're doing what an argument should try to do. And at core of that is, to bring it back to the start of my set of comments, for me, it was a very intuitive idea that me being understood by other people would take a lot of work. That it would take a certain kind of craft, a confidence, a willingness to do it. And I think that is the purpose that underlies, even beneath or even beyond the immediate problem of polarization. I think that's the impetus for my wanting to write this book, which is, when we're able to disagree well with one another, we can have more resilient communities, we can flush out better ideas, we can better manage conflict. All of those things are important. But perhaps most importantly of all, I think we can face each other in our fullness. We can be more visible and more legible to the other side. And through that process, form deeper relationships, and be able to carry on a conversation with someone else. So that's, I think, where all these disagreements lead us in the end, is, can we find better ways of talking to one another? And I think debate offers some helpful pieces to that. It's by no means the only set of tools we need, but I wanted to add it to the toolkit that people have as they try and do this very difficult thing. So I will stop talking for a moment and take questions that you might have about anything I said, or anything else that's on your mind. So thank you again for having me, and thank you for hearing me out. And feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and start talking, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I don't really have any questions.
Or you can type something in the chat.
Yeah, I was curious about what you were going to say, and the book sounds very interesting, because because I'm similar, like I would just avoid conflict and just not talk about it or avoid certain people. And you're right, at this point, and it's, the country's so divided, and it's kind of unfortunate, But I always wished I had a debate team in my school, and we didn't. And I know it, my nieces and nephews, I used to tell them, join the debate team, join the debate team. But I don't think any of them ever did. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I feel the same way. And I don't, and I think that, I don't know how it is for you, but I think the feeling never goes away. And it's also not consistent, at least in my experience, like I feel sometimes quite expansive. And then the next day, you don't much feel like arguing. And for me, maybe that feeling is especially jarring, because when I go to speak now, I go as a debater, right? And then in the dinner after the speech or something like that, I'm sort of nodding along.
Right.
So I think that's a big part.
Takes a lot of energy.
I think it does. I guess the thing that helped me, I think, is both an attention to, so what we're doing when we're getting to that agreement that precedes the disagreement is setting a condition, right, in which we're less likely to be hurt, right, in which some of the fatigue of wasting time we might be able to avoid, right? But more than that, my hope is that rather than just, in some of these free speechy kind of debates, it's very often just kind of like saying to people, you should go out and disagree, or you should talk freely, or you should say what you think. And it's like, the question for me was and always is, how?
Right.
And if we can build some capacity, right, and give people a starting place of, this is how we're going to start building an argument, even if it's sort of pro forma at the beginning, I think it gives us a starting place. And I think all of that reduces what for me feels like the leap of faith that's required, or the leap of confidence that's required before you even disagree at all.
Eleanor typed in the chat. She said, wonderful presentation. You did not speak about research as preparation. And do you include that in your book?
I do. It's an important part of it. I'll say two things about it. I think the first thing is and it depends on the format of debate. So some debate formats allow you to do a lot of research beforehand. You get the topic a month in advance, a week in advance. Other formats give it to you less than an hour with it to go. So there's research that you have as a continual work in progress. There's also more dedicated research that you do. I think debate teaches you two things about that process of research. The first is that on its own, a study or a scientific finding or or a case study from history of when this has happened before, those are artifacts that give us a lot of confidence when we stumble on them, right? Especially when they confirm our own beliefs. But I think one of the things debate shows you is it's often not enough to just kind of wave it and to put it forward, right? That it has to be presented to the other side as part of a broader argument in a way that explains why this piece of evidence is sufficient to justify your believing in it or taking the action that you're asking them to take. So I think one is the evidence is always a part of the argument. And I think maybe the second thing I'll just briefly say is so much of debating is an exercise in feeling very certain in your side, and research is a part of that. So research almost feels like a motivated process where you know you're going to have to present this side of the argument, so you're picking the best arguments that you can for and picking the best pieces of evidence that you can for your side. And I think one of the things that the best debaters do very consciously is they do something called the side switch exercises, where they imagine they're on the other side of the topic and try and come up with the best arguments for their side, try and come up with the evidence that will support that position, or go through your own case of arguments and evidence as though you believe something else and to poke as many holes as you can find, right? And that experience of setting aside certainty for a moment, I think gives us some measure of humility, but creates that little wriggle room for progress when you see that the certainty that you feel about an issue is kind of bounded, right? That it could be another way. And often that experience, I think, can be helpful, and that technique can be useful, especially after you've sat with a particular research process for a while. I think someone
Sorry,
in
unmute.
the chat said
Okay,
they.
sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Bo. I missed part of your presentation, but I had a memory, and I wondered if anyone else recalls this program. I was driving once, and a number of years ago, but they were broadcasting it on NPR, and it was a program where they would get people from opposite sides of an issue, particularly a political issue, and before an audience. So let's just say maybe it was gun control. So you had two people with very strong beliefs on opposite sides. But then what they had to do is they had to say, this is John, and John believes, and they had to get inside that person's head and present the arguments from that side and then the opposite. And I just thought that was really neat. I never forget hearing that. And I'm not sure if it teaches the proper debate techniques, but also maybe to, like you said, an exercise in humility, and maybe, just maybe, you might have something in common from these two sides. You might find out, and then you had the audience and they could ask questions. So I don't know if anyone remembers that and what that program was, but.
That's really interesting. And very much in line with that kind of exercise of trying to faithfully represent what the other side believes, right? And that exercise that that you're describing, that I'm describing, in that instance, it actually doesn't really make sense to misrepresent the other side, right? Because when you do that, you lose any opportunity of persuading them, right? You give them the sense that they haven't been heard adequately, And without that feeling, there isn't that hope of persuading them. And so, it's a little bit hard even to think about how we describe that process, and what we describe the result of that kind of exercise as being. And the way in which I try and write about it in the book is it's not quite empathy, because you're not fully getting what the other side is saying. You're trying, but there's a limit to what, to how much you can truly empathize. But it may create the conditions for something like empathy to arise when we are, as you say, in a more humble position, when we're listening intently, when we are making room for both sides of an issue to have a role in this conversation, right? So I think, the image that we have of arguments is something like sumo wrestling, right? Where one person has to be knocked out of the ring, whereas I think a more fruitful conversation is that it's not that the doubts or the ambivalences or even the shortcomings of one's perspective ever goes away, right? It's that, both winning and losing an argument is more textured than that. And I think that might be a better way of thinking about what the outcome of an argument may be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Melanie, you want to make your comment?
I have a lot of kids kind of screaming in the background, so I just wrote in the chat that like listening to you talk, it made me realize, which I don't think I'd really thought about before, but you just also spoke about again, is how important when you are in a formal debate, listening is, because you have to listen in order to understand the argument that your opponent team is making. And that is I think it is really valuable, that deep listening, because you have to kind of try to make sense of what they're saying and understand it well enough that you can, respond to it. And I think a lot of times in the real world, in kind of just, the kind of arguments that we have, like political arguments, a lot of times it's more reactive and emotional, and we don't have that deep listening. It just does not happen at all. So I just think it is something nice that kind of the formal debate space allows.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though in debating, when you think about a debater, it's the person at the front of the room. As you know, Melanie, from your work as a coach, actually, most of the time you're not even talking, you're listening, right? And research is a process of listening too. And so the minutes for which you talk is a fraction of the total time that you spend in the activity, and it is earned in some ways by that other time, right? And there are all these kinds of little norms that the debate community has developed to kind of ensure that people do this. So for example, in some forms of debate, it can be as extreme as, if an argument is not responded to, the judge must weight it as true, right? And that's kind of an exercise as a way to ensure you're really responding to the other side. And I'm not, it opens itself up for some abuses, right? Someone making a million arguments and saying, look, they didn't respond, so it must be true. But the small decisions that we make all the time to sidestep an inconvenient argument, to misrepresent, as you mentioned, those are abuses too, right? And they're not abuses of speech, but they're abuses of listening and of our receptiveness and our responsiveness, and those things have a degrading effect on our disagreements too. And so the importance of listening to debate, I think, gets at something quite right about why it matters.
I do have a question, which is you talked about politics and political debates. If there was any one or one thing you could change about how politics are debated, what change would you make?
That's a great question. I think the first is I would force each side to talk for longer. I think this mode of 1 minute opening statement and then 30-second it is a problem with our public conversation that people on YouTube and Facebook are going to chop up the video and send around 2-second clips. That's a problem. But it feels that an appropriate response to that is not to do that work ahead of time and to make our public discussions a series of sound bites. And actually, and Melanie, you might have seen that with your students. Speaking for 7 minutes is actually quite hard. 7 minutes in a row is quite hard, unless you have some stuff to say. And I suspect when you really require politicians to speak for 7 minutes, 8 minutes uninterrupted, but give the other side a chance to respond, and then you get a chance back. You're often going to see people run out of things to say. And that's a problem, right? That's a problem when the scale of the arguments they're making or the claims they're making is so disproportionate with the thought that's gone into it, with the reasons, with the evidence that's been put forward. So there's a request in the chat to repeat the 4 Ws. So that's: what is the argument? Why is it true? When has it happened before? Is there a case or an example? And who cares? Right? Why does it matter? And part of the reasons why it's hard to get to 7 minutes in the first instance is you can't get there, I don't think, without hitting those different components of an argument, right? You can't get there just by repeating your point over and over and over again, because that just doesn't take that much time. So I think that is probably the biggest structural change I would make to it. I think independent of us being elected to the Presidential Commission on Debates, I do think a population that is more discerning of good arguments, right? That can discern good arguments from bad, that knows to name the kind of manipulations people engage in when they're involved in bad faith arguments, knows how to respond. That such a population has a degree of immunity, right, against those manipulations that we see on the public stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you repeat the 4 arguments just quickly one more time?
Yep, I can.
The
So
4 Ws, sorry.
no worries. So it's so what is the argument? Why is it true? When has it happened before? And who cares?
Okay. Thank you very much, Bo Seo, for an excellent, very interesting program.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth and Rebecca. Thank you everybody for joining and for your thoughtful contributions. Have a really wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you both.